The woman collapsed against the wooden gate, just as the first stars pierced the darkening California sky, her whole body trembling so violently that the hinges rattled with a metallic groan that carried across the quiet ranch yard. Samuel Vance had been checking the last of his horses for the night when he heard that sound, a desperate rattling that spoke of human need rather than wind or animal. He set down the brush he had been using on his stallion and walked toward the front gate, his boots crunching on the dry earth of his property just outside Skidoo, California. The year was 1897, and though the wildest days of the West were beginning to fade into memory, danger still lurked in the high desert country where his ranch sat nestled between rocky hills and scrubland. When he reached the gate, Samuel found her there, a young woman with dark hair falling loose from what had once been a proper bun, her dress torn at the hem and covered in dust and what looked like dried blood. She looked up at him with wide green eyes that held equal parts terror and hope, and he could see her lips moving though no sound came out at first. "Please," she finally managed to whisper, her fingers clutching at the wooden slats. "Please help me. They are coming." Samuel did not hesitate. He lifted the latch and swung the gate open, catching her as she nearly fell forward into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, as though she had not eaten properly in days, and he could feel the rapid hammering of her heart against his chest as he steadied her. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm. "You are safe here. Let me get you inside." She nodded weakly, her legs barely supporting her weight as he guided her across the yard toward his ranch house. It was a modest structure, but well built with thick adobe walls that kept out both the scorching summer heat and the bitter winter cold that could descend on these high desert elevations. He pushed open the door and led her to a chair near the fireplace, where the embers from his earlier fire still glowed with warmth. "Sit here," he instructed, reaching for a blanket that hung over the back of another chair. He draped it around her shoulders and then moved to light a lamp, wanting to see her injuries more clearly. In the yellow glow of the lamplight, Samuel could see that the blood on her dress was not her own, or at least not much of it. There were scratches on her hands and arms, the kind that came from running through brush and rough terrain, but no serious wounds that he could immediately identify. What concerned him more was the look in her eyes, the way they kept darting toward the door as though expecting someone to burst through it at any moment. "My name is Samuel Vance," he said, kneeling down in front of her chair so that he was at her eye level. "This is my ranch and you are safe here. Can you tell me your name?" She took a shaking breath, her hands clutching the blanket tightly. "Grace," she said softly. "Grace Brennan." "Grace," he repeated, nodding. "That is a good name. Can you tell me what happened? Who is coming?" Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Samuel thought she might break down completely, but she seemed to gather some inner strength, swallowing hard before she spoke. "I was traveling with a wagon train from Missouri," Grace began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were heading to San Francisco, where my aunt lives. She sent for me after my parents died of influenza last winter. I had no other family, no reason to stay in Missouri, so I used what little money they left me to join a group heading west." Samuel nodded, encouraging her to continue. He moved to the stove and began heating water for coffee, knowing she would need something warm to drink, and that the familiar ritual might help calm her nerves. "Everything was fine until we got into California," Grace continued. 3 days ago, we made camp near a canyon about 30 miles north of here. That night, men came. They were not Indians, they were white men, outlaws, I think. They had their faces covered with bandanas and they had guns." She paused, and Samuel could see her hands beginning to shake again. He brought her a cup of water first, knowing the coffee would take a few more minutes. They wanted our money, our supplies, everything, Grace said after taking a sip. The wagon master, Mr. Thompson, he tried to negotiate with them, but they shot him. They just shot him right there in front of everyone. Then they started going through the wagons, taking whatever they wanted. "How did you get away?" Samuel asked gently. One of the other travelers, a man named Mr. Patterson, he created a distraction. He knocked over a lantern, and in the confusion of the fire that started, he told me to run. He said to head south, that there were ranches and settlements in that direction, so I ran. She looked down at her hands. "I do not know what happened to the others. I just ran and kept running. I have been walking for 3 days, hiding during the day when I could, trying to follow the stars at night like my father taught me." Samuel felt a surge of anger at the men who had done this. The West was supposed to be getting more civilized, more lawful, but there were still plenty of places where might-made right and decent people suffered for it. "You said they are coming," he reminded her. "Did you see them following you?" Grace nodded. "This morning, just after sunrise, I looked back from a ridge and saw dust in the distance. Riders. I cannot be certain it was them, but I did not want to wait to find out. I ran again, and then I saw your ranch, and I just hoped." Her voice trailed off. Samuel stood and walked to the window, looking out into the darkness. His ranch was fairly isolated, which was usually an advantage when he wanted peace and quiet to work with his horses. But now that isolation meant that help would be hours away, even if he rode hard for the nearest town. Skidoo itself was more of a mining camp than a proper town, with only a few hundred residents and no real law enforcement to speak of. "How many men did you see at the wagon train?" he asked. "6, I think," Grace replied. "Maybe 7. It was dark and chaotic." Samuel turned back to face her, his jaw set with determination. "Then we prepare. If they are coming here, they will not find an easy target." Over the next hour, Samuel moved with practiced efficiency. He had been a soldier once, years ago during the Indian Wars, and though he had left that life behind to raise horses in peace, he had not forgotten the lessons learned. He checked his rifles, loaded his revolvers, and positioned ammunition in strategic locations around the house. Grace watched him work, her initial terror slowly giving way to a cautious hope. "You do not have to do this," she said as he barred the shutters from the inside. "I could leave, try to make it to Skidoo on foot. I do not want to bring trouble to your door." Samuel paused and looked at her directly. "Grace, I opened my gate to you. That means something out here. It means you are under my protection, and I do not turn people away when they need help. We will face this together." Something in his words, or perhaps in the steady certainty of his gaze, seemed to reach her, and she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will do whatever I can to help." "Can you shoot?" he asked. She shook her head. "My father tried to teach me once, but I was never very good at it." "That is all right," Samuel assured her. "You can reload for me if it comes to that, but with luck, they will not find us, or they will see that I am prepared and decide it is not worth the trouble." They settled in to wait, and as the minutes stretched into hours with no sign of riders, the tension in the room slowly began to ease. Samuel made coffee and heated some stew left over from his dinner, insisting that Grace eat something. She protested at first, saying she was too nervous to have an appetite, but once she took the first bite, she realized how hungry she actually was and finished the bowl quickly. "When did you last eat?" Samuel asked, noting the way she had devoured the simple meal. "Yesterday morning," Grace admitted. "I had some jerky in my pocket when I ran, but I finished it yesterday afternoon." Samuel shook his head and ladled out another portion for her. "Eat," he said simply. "You need your strength." As she ate, Samuel found himself studying her more carefully in the lamplight. She was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with delicate features that spoke of a genteel upbringing. Her hands, though scratched and dirty now, had the look of hands that had held books and needlework rather than plow handles or washing paddles. Yet there was strength in her too. He could see it in the set of her jaw, and the way she held herself despite her exhaustion and fear. "Tell me about Missouri," he said, wanting to distract her from listening for sounds outside. "What was your life like there?" Grace looked up from her stew, seeming surprised by the question. "It was quiet," she said after a moment. "My father was a school teacher and my mother helped him. We lived in a small house near the school and I helped with the younger children sometimes. It was a good life, simple but good." "What made you want to come to California?" Samuel asked. "I did not have much choice," Grace admitted. "After my parents died, the school board brought in a new teacher, a married couple from St. Louis. They were kind, but there was no place for me there anymore. My aunt wrote and said I could come live with her and her husband in San Francisco. She said there were opportunities there for a young woman with education, that I might find work as a governess or even a teacher myself." "You speak well," Samuel observed. "Your father taught you properly." A small, sad smile crossed Grace's face. "He believed education was the key to everything. He used to say that a person with learning could never truly be poor because they carried wealth in their mind." "A wise man," Samuel said. They talked through the night, taking turns resting while the other kept watch. Samuel learned that Grace loved poetry, especially Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, and that she played piano tolerably well. She learned that Samuel had been born in Texas, had served in the Army for 6 years, and had settled in California 4 years ago after his discharge. He told her about his horses, how he bred them for stamina and temperament rather than just speed, selling them to ranchers and the occasional cavalry buyer who came through. As dawn began to lighten the sky, painting the desert hills in shades of pink and gold, there had been no sign of any riders. Samuel allowed himself to hope that perhaps the outlaws had given up the chase or had never been following Grace at all. "Maybe we are safe," Grace said softly, standing near the window and looking out at the beautiful morning. "Maybe," Samuel agreed, though he kept his rifle close. "But we will stay cautious for another day or two, just to be certain." He made breakfast, frying eggs and thick slices of bacon while Grace watched with obvious appreciation. They ate together at his small kitchen table, and Samuel noticed how different the house felt with another person in it. He had lived alone since settling here, content with the solitude and his horses for company. But having Grace there, hearing her voice and her gentle laughter when he told a self-deprecating story about a horse that had once outsmarted him, made him realize how much he had been missing without knowing it. After breakfast, Samuel showed Grace around the ranch properly. His land stretched across several hundred acres, most of it rough country good only for grazing. But he had built his house near a natural spring that provided reliable water year-round, and he had constructed several corrals and a decent-sized barn for his horses. He currently had 15 animals, including 3 mares he was breeding, a young stallion he was training, and several geldings in various stages of readiness for sale. Grace was enchanted by the horses, particularly a dappled gray mare named Stella who came to the fence and nuzzled her hand gently. "She is beautiful," Grace breathed, stroking the mare's soft nose. "She is also gentle and patient," Samuel said. "I have been thinking of keeping her as a riding horse rather than selling her. She would be perfect for someone learning to ride." Grace looked at him with curiosity. "Do you think I might learn? I have never ridden a horse before, only traveled in wagons and carriages." "I could teach you," Samuel offered, "if you stay long enough." The words hung in the air between them, both of them suddenly aware of the uncertainty of Grace's situation. She could not stay at his ranch indefinitely. It would not be proper for one thing. And for another, she had her own life to build in San Francisco with her aunt. Before either of them could say anything more, Samuel's dogs began barking frantically from where they had been sniffing around the far corral. Samuel's hand went immediately to the revolver at his hip, and he moved to position himself between Grace and whatever was coming. "Get back to the house," he said quietly. "Bar the door and stay away from the windows." But Grace did not move. "Samuel, look," she said, pointing toward the ridge to the north. He followed her gaze and felt his muscles tense. There were riders coming, at least 4 of them that he could see, moving at a steady pace down the rocky slope toward his property. "Go," he said more urgently. "Now, Grace." This time she obeyed, running back toward the house while Samuel moved to get a better vantage point. He positioned himself near the barn where he had cover, but could also see the approaching riders clearly. As they got closer, he could make out more details. 4 men on horseback, all armed with bandanas around their necks that could easily be pulled up to cover their faces. They stopped at his gate, the same gate where Grace had collapsed the night before, and one of them called out, "Hello, the house. We are looking for someone. A woman traveling alone. You seen anyone like that?" Samuel stepped out from behind the barn, his rifle held in a deceptively casual position that nonetheless allowed him to bring it to bear in an instant. "Who is asking?" he called back. The man who had spoken nudged his horse forward slightly. He was tall and rangy, with a scraggly beard and eyes that held a calculating coldness. "Name is Dutch Carver. Me and my boys here had some trouble with our wagon train up north. Lost track of one of our passengers. Young woman, dark hair. We are just trying to make sure she is safe." "That's so," Samuel said, keeping his voice neutral. "What kind of trouble?" Dutch shrugged elaborately. "Misunderstanding with some locals. Things got heated. Most of the group scattered. We have been trying to round everyone up, make sure nobody got hurt or lost in the confusion." It was a lie, and not even a particularly good one. Samuel could read the truth in the way the other 3 men sat their horses, hands never far from their weapons, eyes scanning his property with the practiced assessment of men planning violence. "I have not seen anyone," Samuel said flatly. "And I would appreciate it if you moved along. I have work to do." Dutch's expression hardened. "Now, friend, I do not think you understand. This woman, she has something that belongs to us, money that was entrusted to our care for safekeeping during the journey. If she came through here, we need to find her and get that money back where it belongs." "I said I have not seen anyone," Samuel repeated. "Now I am telling you plain, get off my land." One of the other men, a shorter fellow with a scar across his cheek, spat into the dust. "Maybe we should take a look around ourselves, Dutch. Make sure he is telling the truth." Samuel raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at them but making his intent clear. "I do not think so. This is my property and you are not welcome on it. Leave now and we will have no trouble." For a long moment, the 4 outlaws remained motionless, and Samuel could feel the tension building like a physical force. He was outnumbered and outgunned if it came to a straight fight, but he had the advantage of cover and position. More importantly, he could see in their eyes that they were calculating the cost, trying to decide if whatever they wanted with Grace was worth risking their lives over. Dutch finally pulled his horse back slightly. "All right, friend, we will go. But if you do see this woman, you tell her we are looking for her. Tell her we just want what is ours, and then she can go on her way in peace." "I will keep that in mind," Samuel said dryly. The 4 men turned their horses and rode back the way they had come, but Samuel noticed they did not go far. Once they reached the ridge, they stopped and seemed to be setting up a camp, clearly intending to watch the ranch and wait. Samuel cursed under his breath and made his way back to the house. Grace was waiting just inside the door, her face pale but composed. "They are not leaving, are they?" she asked. "No," Samuel confirmed. "They have camped on the ridge. They will be watching to see if you appear or to see if I ride out for help." "I am so sorry," Grace said, her voice breaking slightly. "I have brought this nightmare to your door." Samuel reached out and took her hand, surprised by the gesture even as he made it. "You did nothing wrong, Grace. Those men out there, they are the ones who chose this path. All you did was try to survive." She looked up at him, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. "What are we going to do?" "We wait them out," Samuel said with more confidence than he felt. "I have supplies enough for a few weeks, and they do not look like the patient type. Eventually they will get bored or someone else will come along and they will have to move on." But even as he said it, Samuel knew it might not be that simple. Men like Dutch Carver did not give up easily, especially if they thought there was money to be had. He needed a plan, something better than just sitting here hoping they would leave. Over the next 2 days, the outlaws maintained their vigil on the ridge. Samuel kept himself busy with ranch work, always staying within sight of the house so Grace would not be alone. At night, they took turns keeping watch again, though Samuel insisted on taking the longer shifts. During those 2 days, something changed between them. Perhaps it was the forced intimacy of the situation, or perhaps it was something that had been there from the beginning, sparked in that first moment when he had caught her at the gate. Samuel found himself noticing small things about Grace. The way she hummed softly while washing dishes, the gentle patience she showed when feeding carrots to the horses, the intelligence that shone in her eyes when they talked in the evenings about books and ideas and dreams. Grace, for her part, began to see beyond Samuel's quiet exterior to the man beneath. She saw his kindness in the way he cared for his animals, his strength in how he faced the danger outside without flinching, his loneliness in the little details of his home that spoke of a man who had stopped hoping for more than solitude. She found herself drawn to him in ways that both frightened and thrilled her. On the 3rd night, they were sitting together near the fireplace, the lamps turned low to conserve oil and to make it harder for anyone outside to see them. Samuel had been mending a piece of tack, his hands moving with practiced skill, while Grace read aloud from a book of Whitman's poetry she had found on his shelf. "I did not take you for a poetry reader," she said with a smile, setting the book aside. Samuel shrugged, a slight smile tugging at his own lips. "A woman I knew once told me I should expand my horizons beyond horse breeding manuals. She gave me that book before I left Texas." Grace felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been jealousy. Was she someone special? "I thought so at the time," Samuel admitted. "Her name was Margaret, and she was the daughter of my commanding officer. She was pretty and educated, and for a while I thought maybe there could be something between us. But she made it clear that she had no interest in being a soldier's wife, much less a rancher's. She wanted city life, society, all the things I could not give her." "I am sorry," Grace said softly. Samuel shook his head. "Do not be. It was for the best. I see that now. She and I, we wanted different things from life. There would have been no happiness in trying to force something that was not meant to be." He looked at Grace then, really looked at her, and she felt her breath catch at the intensity in his eyes. "What about you?" he asked quietly. "Was there someone in Missouri?" Grace felt heat rising to her cheeks. "There was a man," she admitted. "Thomas Fletcher. He worked at his father's mercantile store. He courted me for a few months before my parents died. He was pleasant enough, and I thought maybe." She trailed off. "What happened? After my parents passed, he stopped calling on me. I heard later that his father had forbidden the match. I had no money, no family, nothing to bring to a marriage. He married the banker's daughter 3 months later. Then he was a fool, Samuel said with quiet conviction. Grace looked at him in surprise and then slowly smiled. Perhaps we are both better off without them. Perhaps we are, Samuel agreed. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. Samuel set aside the tack and moved to sit closer to Grace on the settee. "I need to tell you something," he said. "What is it? These past few days, having you here, it has made me realize how empty this place has been. How empty I have been. I know you have your own plans, your own life waiting for you in San Francisco, but He paused, seeming to struggle for words. "I do not want you to go, Grace. I know I have no right to ask, and I know the circumstances that brought you here were terrible, but I am glad you came through that gate. I am glad I found you." Grace felt her heart hammering in her chest. "Samuel, She did not know what to say, how to express the tangle of emotions inside her. He reached out and took her hand gently. "You do not have to say anything. I just needed you to know. Whatever happens, whatever you decide, I want you to know that you mean something to me, more than I expected. More than I probably should admit." Grace squeezed his hand, tears pricking at her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of fear or sorrow. "You mean something to me too," she whispered. "I do not know how it happened so fast, but you do. When I think about leaving, about going to San Francisco and never seeing you again, it hurts. It actually hurts right here." She pressed her free hand to her chest. Samuel moved even closer, raising his other hand to cup her cheek gently. "Then maybe you do not have to leave. Maybe there is another choice." "What choice?" Grace asked, though she thought she knew, hoped she knew. "Stay," Samuel said simply. "Stay here with me. We will find a way to deal with those men outside. We will find a way to make it proper. But stay, Grace. Give us a chance to see if this thing between us is as real as it feels." Grace closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. Every practical bone in her body told her this was madness. She barely knew this man. It had only been 3 days. But her heart knew something different. Her heart recognized something in Samuel that she had never found in Thomas Fletcher or anyone else back in Missouri. Safety, yes, but more than that. Partnership, respect, the possibility of real love. "Yes," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "Yes, I will stay." Samuel smiled then, a full, genuine smile that transformed his entire face, and then he kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. But as Grace responded, leaning into him and wrapping her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more passionate. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I promise I will do right by you," Samuel said, his forehead resting against hers. "We will find a preacher and do this properly. I will not have anyone questioning your honor." Grace laughed softly. "I trust you, Samuel. I do not know why, but I trust you completely." They sat together through the night, talking and planning and stealing kisses in the firelight. But as dawn approached, reality intruded once more. The outlaws were still out there, and Samuel knew they could not continue like this indefinitely. He needed to take action. "I am going to ride to Skidoo today," he announced over breakfast. "I need to get help, proper help. The camp has a deputy of sorts, a man named Bill Crawford who served with me in the army. He is not official law, but he has authority enough, and he has friends who will back him up." Grace felt panic rising in her chest. "But what if they follow you? What if they try to stop you?" "They might try," Samuel admitted. "But I am a better horseman than any of them, and I know this country. I can lose them in the canyons if I need to. You will stay here, keep the doors barred, and do not open them for anyone but me. I will be back before nightfall with help." "Samuel, please," Grace said, grabbing his arm. "Maybe there is another way, maybe we could wait longer." He covered her hand with his. Grace, I want to build a life with you. A real life, not one where we are hiding in this house afraid of what is outside. To do that, I need to deal with this threat. I need to make sure you are truly safe." She knew he was right, but that did not make it any easier to watch him saddle his fastest horse, check his weapons one last time, and prepare to ride out into danger. At the last moment, before he mounted up, Samuel pulled Grace close and kissed her hard. "I will come back to you," he promised. "Nothing will stop that." Then he was gone, racing away from the ranch toward the southeast while the outlaws on the ridge scrambled to follow. Grace watched from the window, her heart in her throat, as Samuel's chestnut gelding stretched out into a full gallop. The outlaws gave chase, but true to his word, Samuel knew the land better than they did. She saw him veer into a narrow canyon and the pursuers followed. Then there was nothing but silence and the empty landscape. The hours that followed were the longest of Grace's life. She tried to keep herself busy with cleaning and small tasks, but her mind kept returning to Samuel, wondering if he was safe, if he had made it to Skidoo, if the outlaws had caught him. She found herself praying, something she had not done much since her parents died, asking God to keep him safe and bring him back to her. As afternoon stretched into evening, Grace heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching and felt her heart leap with hope and fear. She grabbed the rifle Samuel had left for her, her hands shaking as she positioned herself near the door. The hoofbeats stopped outside, and then she heard a voice. "Grace, Grace, it is me. Open the door." "Samuel." Grace nearly sobbed with relief as she threw back the bar and yanked open the door. He stood there looking dusty and tired but unharmed, and she flew into his arms without thinking. "You came back," she said against his chest. "I promised I would," Samuel replied, holding her tightly. Behind him, Grace now noticed, were 5 other men on horseback. They looked rough and capable, men who had lived hard lives in hard country, but their faces showed respect as they looked at Samuel. "Grace, this is Bill Crawford," Samuel said, gesturing to a grizzled man with gray in his beard and a marshal's star pinned to his vest. "And these are some friends of his who have agreed to help us settle this situation." Bill Crawford tipped his hat to Grace. "Madam, Samuel here tells us you have had some trouble. We aim to put that right." Over the next hour they formed a plan. The outlaws were still camped on the ridge, apparently waiting for Samuel to return. Crawford and his men would circle around through the canyons and come up on them from behind, catching them between 2 groups. If the outlaws were smart, they would surrender. If not, well, Crawford and his men were prepared for that too. Samuel insisted on being part of it, though Grace begged him to stay behind. "I have to see this through," he said gently. "I have to know you are truly safe." So Grace watched once more as the men rode out into the twilight, her rifle held ready in case any of the outlaws slipped past them toward the ranch. But as it turned out, she need not have worried. The fight, when it came, was brief and decisive. The outlaws, surprised and outnumbered, threw down their weapons without much resistance. Dutch Carver tried to make a break for it, but Crawford's best rider ran him down within a quarter mile. When Samuel returned with the others, trailing 4 dejected prisoners behind them, Grace finally felt the knot of tension that had been living in her chest for days begin to unravel. "It is over," Samuel said, wrapping her in his arms. "They are going to be taken to the territorial prison to stand trial for murder and robbery. You are safe now, Grace. Truly safe." She clung to him, letting herself cry tears of relief and release. Everything she had been holding inside for the past week, the terror and the exhaustion and the grief for her fellow travelers who had not survived, came pouring out. Samuel held her through it all, murmuring soothing words and stroking her hair. Crawford and his men made camp near the ranch for the night, keeping watch over the prisoners. In the morning, they would begin the journey to deliver the outlaws to justice. But that night, Samuel and Grace sat together on the porch of his ranch house, looking up at the stars that blazed across the clear desert sky. "What happens now?" Grace asked softly. "Now we build that life I mentioned," Samuel replied. "Tomorrow I will ride to Skidoo again, this time to fetch the preacher. If you are still certain this is what you want." Grace turned to look at him, this man who had opened his gate and his heart to her without hesitation. "I am certain," she said firmly. "I have never been more certain of anything." 3 days later, Grace Brennan became Grace Vance in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling Methodist minister in Samuel's living room. Bill Crawford stood as Samuel's witness, and Mrs. Henderson, a kindly woman from Skidoo who had come to help Grace prepare, stood as hers. Grace wore a simple dress that Mrs. Henderson had brought, white cotton with blue flowers embroidered at the collar, and Samuel wore his best suit, dark wool that he kept for special occasions. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Grace with a tenderness that made her feel like she was the most precious thing in the world. And as she looked into his eyes, she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be, with this man in this place, building a life together. The first months of their marriage were a time of adjustment and discovery. Grace learned the rhythms of ranch life, rising early to help Samuel with the horses, cooking meals that gradually improved from merely edible to genuinely good, and slowly transforming the bachelor simplicity of his house into a real home. She hung curtains she sewed herself, planted a kitchen garden near the spring, and filled the shelves with books ordered from San Francisco. Samuel, for his part, discovered the joy of coming home to someone who cared about his day, who listened with genuine interest as he talked about which horses were training well and which needed more work. He taught Grace to ride, starting with gentle Stella and gradually helping her build confidence and skill. He loved watching her face light up with delight when she mastered a new technique or when a foal was born in the spring. They wrote to Grace's aunt in San Francisco, explaining what had happened and assuring her that Grace was safe and happy. The aunt wrote back with mixed feelings, sad that Grace would not be joining her household, but glad that her niece had found love and security. She sent a generous wedding gift, a set of fine china that Grace treasured. As summer turned to fall and then to winter, the ranch prospered. Samuel sold several horses at good prices, and he used the money to make improvements to the property. He built a larger barn and added a proper chicken coop for the hens Grace had bought at the Skidoo market. He also began work on expanding the house, adding 2 more rooms that he hoped would eventually be filled with children. That hope became reality the following summer when Grace discovered she was expecting their first child. Samuel was beside himself with joy and anxiety, suddenly convinced that Grace was too delicate to do any of her normal chores. She laughed at his hovering and insisted she was perfectly capable of continuing her work, though she did let him take over the heavier tasks as her pregnancy progressed. Their son was born on a warm September evening in 1898, delivered by Mrs. Henderson, who had become Grace's closest friend. Samuel held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the tiny, perfect life they had created together. They named him James Whitman Vance, the middle name a tribute to the poet whose words had been part of their courtship. James was a healthy, strong baby who grew quickly, and Grace marveled at how completely her life had changed in just over a year. From a terrified woman fleeing across the desert to a wife and mother with a home and family of her own. As James learned to crawl and then to walk, getting into everything with the fearless curiosity of a toddler. Grace often found herself thinking about that night when she had collapsed at Samuel's gate. She thought about how different her life might have been if he had turned her away, if he had been a different kind of man. But he had not turned her away. He had opened the gate and his heart, and in doing so, he had given her everything she had ever wanted, and some things she had not even known to dream about. 2 years after James was born, Grace gave birth to twin daughters. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the birth itself was long and exhausting. But when it was over and she held both her babies, one in each arm with Samuel sitting beside her on the bed looking equally exhausted and ecstatic, Grace felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. They named the twins Rose Margaret and Lily Ann. Pretty names for pretty babies who looked like miniature versions of their mother with Samuel's strong jaw and determined chin. Raising twins along with an energetic 2-year-old son kept Grace busy from dawn to dusk, but she loved every chaotic minute of it. Samuel helped whenever he could, becoming adept at changing diapers and soothing crying babies in the middle of the night. The ranch continued to grow and thrive. Samuel's reputation as a horse breeder spread, and buyers came from as far away as Nevada and Arizona to see his stock. He hired help during the busiest times, a young man named Tom who was learning the trade, and an older Mexican gentleman named Carlos who was a wizard with training difficult horses. Grace became known in Skidoo and the surrounding areas as a woman of education and refinement, and mothers began bringing their children to her for lessons. What started as informal tutoring of 1 or 2 children grew into a small school that met 3 times a week in the expanded living room. Samuel built proper desks and a chalkboard, and Grace found herself doing what her father had done, passing on the gift of learning to a new generation. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters when they worried about the horses and the children, dry summers when the spring ran lower than usual, and the constant challenges of making a living in an unforgiving land. But through it all, Samuel and Grace faced everything together, their love deepening with each passing year. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Grace with a gift he had been working on in secret for months. He led her outside after dinner, once the children were settled with Mrs. Henderson, who had agreed to watch them for the evening, and walked her to a spot beyond the barn where he had cleared the brush and leveled the ground. "What is this?" Grace asked, confused. "This is where I am going to build you a real schoolhouse," Samuel said, his eyes shining with excitement. "Not just a corner of our house, but a proper building with big windows for light, and a wood stove for heat and room for as many students as want to come. You have done so much good teaching those children, Grace. They deserve a real school, and you deserve a real classroom." Grace stared at him, tears springing to her eyes. "Samuel, that would cost so much. Are you sure we can afford it?" "I sold the cavalry contract last month," Samuel explained. 50 horses over the next 2 years. It is enough to build the school and still keep us comfortable. Besides, this is important. Education is important. Your father was right about that." Grace threw her arms around him, holding him tight. "Have I told you lately that I love you?" she whispered. "You tell me every day," Samuel replied, kissing the top of her head. "But I never get tired of hearing it." The schoolhouse was completed by the following spring. A sturdy building with tall windows that let in the California sunshine, and a pot-bellied stove that would keep it warm in winter. Grace was so proud of it that she cried during the first lesson held there, tears of joy and gratitude that streamed down her face while her students watched in concern until she assured them she was perfectly fine. More years passed, marked by the milestones of their children growing up. James became old enough to help seriously with the horses, showing a natural talent for the work that made Samuel burst with pride. The twins, while identical in appearance, proved to have very different personalities. Rose was quiet and studious, loving books as much as her mother did, while Lily was adventurous and fearless, always trying to keep up with her older brother. When James was 10, Rose and Lily 8, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. She was older now, in her early 30s, and both she and Samuel worried more about this pregnancy than they had the previous ones. But their fourth child, another son they named Thomas William, was born healthy and strong, immediately adored by his older siblings who competed to help care for him. By the time the new century dawned in 1900, the Vance Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the region. Samuel's horses were sought after throughout the West, and Grace's school had educated more than 60 children, some of whom had gone on to universities back east or to successful careers in California's growing cities. They had built something remarkable together, not just in terms of material success, but in the life they had created. Their home was filled with love and laughter, with the sounds of children playing and horses neighing and Grace singing while she worked. It was everything Samuel had hoped for when he had opened that gate so many years ago, and more than Grace had dared to dream when she had collapsed there, shaking and terrified. On quiet evenings, when the children were in bed and the ranch was peaceful under the stars, Samuel and Grace would sit together on their porch, his arm around her shoulders, and talk about how far they had come. They talked about the outlaws who had long since served their time or died in prison, about the wagon train and all the what-ifs that might have led Grace somewhere else. But mostly they talked about the future, about watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own, about growing old together in this place they had built. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked one evening, years after their marriage. "Staying here instead of going to San Francisco, living this life instead of something easier?" Grace looked at him with genuine surprise. "Regret? Samuel, how could I regret any of it? This life, this family, you are everything I could ever want. I was meant to come to that gate. I was meant to find you. I was meant to open it," Samuel agreed, pulling her closer. "Best decision I ever made." As their children grew into teenagers and then young adults, Samuel and Grace watched with pride as each one found their own path. James took over more and more of the horse breeding operation, showing the same dedication and skill his father had. He married a local girl named Sarah, and they built a house on the far end of the property, starting their own family while still being part of the ranch. Rose, true to her love of learning, went to teachers' college in San Francisco, living with Grace's aunt, who was delighted to finally have the company she had hoped for years earlier. She returned after 2 years with a teaching certificate and took over her mother's school, allowing Grace to retire from formal teaching, though she still helped occasionally. Lily married a mining engineer who worked in Skidoo and moved into town, where she became known for her charity work and her efforts to bring culture and refinement to the rough mining camp. She organized concerts and lectures, and she made sure that Grace's school remained funded even as Skidoo boomed and then declined with the fortune of the mines. Thomas, the baby of the family, proved to have a talent for numbers and business. He handled the financial side of the ranch, making investments and deals that kept the operation profitable even as the West continued to change and modernize. By the time Samuel and Grace celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1922, they had 7 grandchildren and another on the way. The ranch had weathered economic downturns, droughts, and the changing times that saw automobiles replacing horses for many purposes. But Samuel had adapted, focusing on breeding horses for ranching and pleasure riding rather than transportation, and the business remained strong. For the anniversary celebration, all their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch. They roasted a steer and made enormous quantities of food, and they danced to music provided by a string band from Skidoo. As the sun set and the party continued by lantern light, Grace found a quiet moment to slip away to the gate where it had all begun. Samuel found her there, standing in the same spot where she had collapsed a quarter-century earlier. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, and she leaned back against him with a contented sigh. "You remember how frightened I was?" Grace asked softly. "I was shaking so hard I thought I might fall apart." "I remember," Samuel said. "I remember thinking I had never seen anyone look so scared and so brave at the same time. I remember opening this gate and knowing, somehow knowing, that my life was about to change." "Mine certainly did," Grace said with a laugh. "I went from having nothing and no one to having everything and everyone, all because you were kind enough to help a stranger." "You were never really a stranger," Samuel said. "Not from that first moment. I think my heart knew you before my head had caught up." Grace turned in his arms to face him, looking up at the man who had saved her life in more ways than one. His hair was gray now, and there were lines around his eyes and mouth, but to her, he was as handsome as he had been that first night. More so because she knew every facet of him, every strength and weakness, every hope and fear, and she loved all of it. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Samuel asked, though he was smiling. "For opening the gate, for opening your heart. For 25 years of love and partnership and adventure. For our children and our life and everything we have built together. For all of it, Samuel. Thank you for all of it." Samuel kissed her then, a long, slow kiss that held 25 years of love and the promise of however many more they had left. When they finally pulled apart, they could hear their grandchildren calling for them, wanting them to come back to the party. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the house, toward the noise and light and love of their gathered family. Behind them, the gate stood open as it usually did these days, a symbol of the welcome and generosity that had defined their lives together. As they rejoined the celebration, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Samuel caught Grace's eye across the crowded yard and smiled. She smiled back, and in that look, they shared the knowledge of everything they had overcome and everything they had become. A terrified woman and a lonely cowboy, brought together by chance and fate on a desert night, who had built a love story that would be told to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren for generations to come. The story of how she was shaking at his gate, the cowboy opened it, and in doing so, opened his heart to a love that would last a lifetime and beyond, growing and deepening with each passing year, solid as the California hills that surrounded their ranch, enduring as the stars that had witnessed their first kiss and would shine down on their descendants long after they were gone. Years continued to pass in the way years do, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. Samuel's health began to fail when he reached his 70s, his body finally showing the wear of a lifetime of hard physical work. Grace cared for him tenderly, returning the devotion he had always shown her. Even in his declining years, his eyes would light up whenever she entered a room, and he would reach for her hand like a young man reaching for his sweetheart. They would sit together on the porch they both loved, watching the sun set over the ranch they had built together, and Samuel would tell her again how blessed he felt to have found her, how opening that gate had been the beginning of his real life. When Samuel passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76, Grace grieved deeply, but also felt grateful for every single day they had shared. She continued to live at the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and she lived to see her great-grandchildren born and grow. She would tell them stories about their grandfather, about the cowboy who had saved her life and won her heart. She would tell them about that night when she had collapsed at his gate, terrified and alone, and how he had opened it without hesitation. She would tell them that sometimes the worst moments of your life can lead to the best, and that kindness can change everything. Grace lived to be 82 years old, sharp-minded and beloved until the end. When she finally passed away, surrounded by 3 generations of family, her last words were reported to be, "I am coming, Samuel. Wait for me at the gate." She was buried beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple stone markers that bore their names and the years of their births and deaths. But more enduring than any stone was the legacy they left behind. A family built on love and dedication, a ranch that continued to thrive under James's capable management, a school that Rose's own daughter would eventually run, and a community that remembered them as examples of what was best about the Old West. The gate where they had met was preserved by their descendants, kept in good repair even as the rest of the ranch modernized around it. It became a tradition for young couples in the family to stand at that gate when they got engaged, honoring the place where the family's great love story had begun. And sometimes, on quiet desert evenings when the stars blazed overhead and the wind whispered through the dry grass, people claimed they could feel something special near that old wooden gate. Some said it was just the romance of the place's history making them sentimental. But others, the ones who believed in such things, said it was the lingering presence of a love so strong that it had left an imprint on the very land itself. A love that had started with an act of simple kindness, with one man choosing to open a gate and let in not just a frightened woman, but hope and future and family and joy. A love that had grown through hard work and dedication, through facing challenges together and celebrating triumphs side by side. A love that had created a legacy measured not in acres or dollars, but in the generations of children who carried forward the values their great-great-grandparents had lived by. The story of Samuel and Grace Vance became woven into the history of that part of California, told and retold with the kind of reverence reserved for true love stories. Young people heard it and hoped to find something similar. Old married couples heard it and remembered their own courtships. Everyone who heard it was reminded that sometimes, in the darkest moments, salvation can come from the most unexpected places. All it takes is someone willing to open a gate, to take a chance on a stranger, to lead with their heart instead of their fear. Samuel Vance had done that on a September night in 1897, and in doing so, he had not only saved Grace Brennan's life, but had created something that would echo through time. A love story for the ages, born in the Wild West, tempered by hardship, and proven to be as enduring as the land itself. The ranch still stands, now run by the 5th generation of the Vance family. The schoolhouse Grace taught in has been converted into a small museum celebrating the history of the area. And the gate, that simple wooden gate where it all began, remains as a reminder that the greatest adventures often start with a single act of kindness, and that love, real love, is built not in grand gestures but in the daily choice to open your heart to another person and let them in, fully and completely, for all the days of your life.